Novak, working for the Belgian National CERT, and I'm your session chair for this morning. So the usual rules apply. Please turn your phones and other noisy devices off, or at least silence them. Please remember to fill in the surveys, the presentation surveys after the presentation, and there will be 5 minutes for questions after Justin's presentation. So Justin is a researcher at Carnegie Mellon and CERT, and he will tell us about improving sector-based incident response. So let's give him a warm welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Lionel, for the introduction. As he said, my name is Justin Novak. I'm with the Software Engineering Institute with the CERT Coordination Center. And I'm going to be talking about Sector CSIRTs today. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about a new document, a new guide that we've published recently called the Sector CSIRT Framework. And we hope this guide is a tool that teams can use to help them develop new Sector CSIRT and sector-based incident response capabilities. So just a quick preview. We'll talk first at the beginning about defining sectors and defining a Sector CSIRT, right? We have to know what we're talking about before we can really understand the challenges. But then we'll talk a little bit about building CSIRTs and why some of the existing approaches don't necessarily work really well for Sector CSIRTs. And that's what led us to our new approach, which is this framework that we've developed and we hope to share with everyone. And this new approach is centered on what we call a national cybersecurity ecosystem. So we'll talk about what that is and why it's important when you're developing a Sector CSIRT. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about the framework itself, what's in it, what isn't in it, and how hopefully you can use it when developing these sector-based capabilities, right? Before we do that, though, a little bit of context just about myself and our team. And this is important for understanding how we arrived at this problem and the solution. So the security operations team at the SEI has a mission of developing CSIRT capabilities and building capacity for existing CSIRTs. So we've been doing this a little more than 7 years, building all kinds of CSIRT teams with partners around the world, national CSIRTs, sector CSIRTs, other types of incident response organizations, SOCs, and so on and so forth. So, and before that, really, the SEI has been doing the same mission for even longer, for decades, really. So what we have is a lot of experience and a lot of lessons learned in the area of developing CSIRT teams, including Sector CSIRTs. So that's just a little bit of context about where we're coming from and how we arrived at this problem. So starting at the beginning, when we're talking about Sector CSIRTs, obviously we want to understand why sectors are important, what makes sectors so unique that they need these specialized organizations called Sector CSIRTs. So this is just one definition of a critical infrastructure sector. This comes from CISA in the United States. And they say that a critical sector of an economy is defined as infrastructure whose assets, systems, etc., are so vital that their incapacitation would have a debilitating effect on security, economic security, et cetera, right? So the key word in this definition is critical, which is interesting because that raises the question, what about sectors that aren't critical, right? So this is, again, just one definition. It's a good definition, but it's certainly not the only one. Our definition is a little bit more broad because when we were developing this tool, we wanted it to be broadly applicable to all Sector CSIRTs, to all sectors, not just critical ones, but all of them. So there's a couple different challenges when you have a broad definition like that. For one, you're talking about organizations with a range of capability levels, highly mature organizations and new organizations. You're talking about systems that might not necessarily all be the same. You may have a sector, maybe the energy sector, where you have a lot of legacy industrial control systems mixed with new smart technologies, connected grids, things like that. So you have this sort of fragmented landscape when you're talking about a sector, and it can be really challenging. But like I said, when we developed this tool, we want it to be broadly applicable So we've taken a definition of a sector that is very broad, and we say that a sector is just any group of stakeholders who are part of the same sector of an economy and are interested in incident response. So we take that broad definition of a sector. So as incident responders, we have to ask, what are the unique challenges in defending this sector and in responding to incidents? Well, it turns out that the answer is in the term, right? The sector is a challenge because of sector-specific threats. So if we think about the financial sector, you have threats, you have malware that's designed specifically to attack financial systems, credit card processing systems, et cetera. Different sectors have different threats, and they have different needs when it comes to incident response. And this is a result of specialization of the economy and then specialization of the attacker, right? When an attacker develops an attack vector that is specific to one sector, we as responders have to have equally specialized response. So that leads us to this thing called a Sector CSIRT. Again, we take a broad view of it here. We take a very broad definition for our framework because we want it to be broadly applicable. But we say a Sector CSIRT is any body that is responsible for incident response and management in a subset of a country or an economy. So you'll notice that in this definition, the only thing that we really say you must do in order to be a Sector CSIRT is incident response. Now, of course, that's not a comprehensive list of what a Sector CSIRT is going to do, or any CSIRT really. There are a lot of other things you can do. Communication and coordination, disseminating information, providing training, capacity building, awareness, serving as a CSIRT of last resort for other CSIRTs. There are a lot of different things a Sector CSIRT may do, but in order to qualify under our definition, the only thing you have to do is incident response. So this is what we think a Sector CSIRT is. So now the question is, why are these things called Sector CSIRTs so beneficial? Why do we want to develop them and implement them in our country or economy or whatever the case may be? I talked a little bit about the expertise, right? The specialization of the incident response capability to meet the specialization of the threat that exists. But there are other advantages. One of the main advantages is the enabling of shared risk or shared risk avoidance, right? So if you have a sector in your country, let's say it's the energy sector, and you have several major companies, several big stakeholders, and they're not working together, then they're all facing the same threat surface, right? They're all facing the same number of threats. There's a fixed number of threats out there. It may change from day to day, but at any given point in time, there are only so many threats out there. And if everyone in the sector is working separately, then they all have to deal with the same number of threats. It's the same quantity of risk that you're facing. But if we work together, we can share that risk and spread it out, and then we're only facing maybe a fraction of the total risk that we would have otherwise had. And a Sector CSIRT is something that can enable this type of sharing, this risk and threat sharing. So this is really one of the great benefits of a Sector CSIRT. So we know they're important, we know what they are, and we know we want to implement them. Before we talk about how to do that, just a real quick note on terminology. I'm using the term Sector CSIRT here because that's what we use in the framework in the actual document. But you'll see other terms out there in other resources, in other places, sectoral CSIRTs, sector-based cyber centers, ISACs. An ISAC is, some would argue, is somewhat different than a Sector CSIRT, but we still consider all of these things to be sector-based incident response capabilities. Even if it has a more narrow mission like an ISAC, it's still an incident response capability because they have some role to play in that incident response mission. So I'm using the term Sector CSIRT here. Just a note that we feel this tool that we've developed is broadly applicable to all of these capabilities if you're developing one of those. So the question is, how do we build these capabilities? We know why they're important. We know what they can do for us in terms of reducing the risk, sharing the threats. and developing that specialization or that expertise. So how do we do them? It turns out we know a lot about developing CSIRTs, but it also turns out we don't know a lot about developing sector CSIRTs specifically, right? Like I said, our team's been doing this for 7 years, the SEI for much longer. We have a lot of documentation and a lot of resources. The SEI handbook for CSIRTs was first published more than 20 years ago, and it's still a very relevant, very important resource for teams that are developing CSIRTs. There's the first CSIRT handbook. There are other resources out there. And there are some specific specialized resources, one's for industry, one's for PCERTs, et cetera. But there is no, or at least there was no, in 2019 when we started this project, there was no resource that really told you how to develop a sector CSIRT and address the specific challenges that are associated with that task. So that's what we set out to correct. So let's go back to the beginning of developing a CSIRT, or I'm sorry, developing a sector CSIRT. As I said, we've learned a lot of lessons over the years in actually doing this, and the key thing that we learned was that a sector CSIRT kind of sits in the middle, right? So here, these are our sector CSIRTs right in the middle of this big diagram, and there's a lot going on here. It's intentionally busy. There are a lot of organizations. There are a lot of different levels, and there are a lot of interactions. So we have sort of a regional level at the top, and then a national level, and then you have the sector level, and then beneath that, you have individual organizations, private sector organizations, corporations, et cetera, et cetera. And the unique thing about a sector CSIRT is that it really interacts with all of these things, right? On looking up, you have CSIRTs have a lot of interactions with maybe a national CSIRT or a regional body, maybe other government agencies. A financial sector CSIRT may, for example, work with a Treasury Department or something like that. And then they work laterally, often communicating with other sector CSIRTs, maybe because they're sharing information or they're doing training together or something like that. And then, of course, working down, they're working with their constituency. So this is a really unique position that the sector CSIRT, it's a unique position that it has within this group and all these interactions. So think about if we don't have a sector CSIRT, you still have all these other things. You have all these organizations, all these stakeholders. So if I have all these interactions and all these organizations sitting here, and they're working together, maybe they're sharing information, cooperating on incident response, and then I go over here and I say, okay, I'm going to build a sector CSIRT because it's going to help. And then I take that sector CSIRT and I drop it right here in the middle, what's going to happen? Disruption. Disruption is what's going to happen. And related to disruption, you're going to have challenges with implementing that sector CSIRT capability because all the people who have been disrupted by this, all the organizations who have been disrupted, there's going to be ruffled feathers, there's going to be people upset. You may have, for example, maybe a national CSIRT was fulfilling a certain mission, and if that mission is taken away and given to a sector CSIRT, you may have some loss of prestige, loss of funding, things like that. And on the lower level, if you have an industry who is used to operating in a certain way and you suddenly put a sector CSIRT in, now they may have new reporting requirements or something like that that may, again, ruffle some feathers or cause some disruption. Right, so two challenges, disruption, and then challenges in implementing this capability as a result of that disruption. So these are, in our experience, have been the primary challenges and the primary barriers to implementing sector CSIRTs. So those are the challenges we set about to solve when we were developing this framework. So we thought about this and we kind of went back to the beginning and said, we need to look at this group of stakeholders and all these interactions and place them at the center of what we're doing. And we called this group the National Cybersecurity Ecosystem. So simple definition, it's just the group of stakeholders that make up that sector, and this can be constituents, it can be government agencies, law enforcement, really anyone who has any stake in incident response or cybersecurity for that particular sector. So that's the national cybersecurity ecosystem. How do we understand the national cybersecurity ecosystem and some of the more granular, more specific challenges that we'll see when dealing with it when we want to build Sector CSIRT? Well, we need to consider each of these teams and what their needs are, right? What do they need? What can they get out of this? What can they bring to the table when we're developing Sector CSIRT? So we need to think about things like establishing trust, right? How do we get organizations to share information with a Sector CSIRT or with each other? How does it work right now in that national cybersecurity ecosystem? And how will that change when I put in a Sector CSIRT? Who is responsible for what? What is the role of the national CSIRT? This is connected to roles and responsibilities. So is the national CSIRT currently in charge of communications and information sharing? How will that change when I develop a Sector CSIRT? What kind of disruption is that going to cause? All these different considerations that are important for understanding that national cybersecurity ecosystem and the role that it plays. So we thought of some questions that we wanted to ask when we're developing this Sector CSIRT. So these are, again, connected to those types of information that we want to understand, but we want to ask, what is the role of the national CSIRT? What are they doing? What services do they provide? What services don't they provide? We want to ask about the relationship between the Sector CSIRT and the national CSIRT. Is it going to be a relationship where the Sector CSIRT reports to or is subordinate to the national CSIRT? Or are they going to be equals? Or are they simply going to have no relationship? These are all considerations that you have to take into account when you're developing your capability. What if there's no national CSIRT at all? We've seen a couple cases where countries have gone forward with developing Sector CSIRTs before they develop a national CSIRT. Or maybe a Sector CSIRT exists and it's a private association. Maybe an association of bankers has put together an incident response capability before that country was able to stand up a national CSIRT or a national cyber center or something like that. So you have to ask all these questions and think about it when you're developing that Sector CSIRT, and think about what do we have currently in the national cybersecurity ecosystem and how are we going to change things. So that led us to the Sector CSIRT Framework, right? So the framework is a guide, and it's designed as a tool for helping any parties, any interested parties who are wanting to develop a Sector CSIRT. And we have two goals with this document, and they're to solve those two challenges that I mentioned. First, to help teams develop these sector-based CSIRTs or sector-based capabilities. And second, to integrate those capabilities into the national cybersecurity ecosystem, right? So our challenges were disruption of the ecosystem and then implementation. So we want to solve those challenges by developing effective teams and integrating them effectively into the national cybersecurity ecosystem. So 6 parts in the framework. First, well, before I go through the parts, what's important to emphasize is that at every step of this process, we put that national cybersecurity ecosystem kind of at the forefront, right? So we think about it when we're going through each of these steps. So step 1 is satisfying the prerequisites. This is thinking about things like, where am I going to get funding? Who's going to staff this organization? This is, what services will my Sector CSIRT provide? What services won't it provide? Who is the constituency? So when we're thinking about those things, let's take the example of what services I'm going to provide. You can't just go in and say, I'm going to create a Sector CSIRT, and it's going to provide awareness training and communications and information sharing, because there may be someone already in that ecosystem doing that, right? You can't just go ahead and say, this Sector CSIRT is going to provide digital forensics assistance. Maybe law enforcement is already doing that. So you have to consider all these stakeholders when you're going through those prerequisites, right? What about gathering information? This is the process of going out to that group of stakeholders and actually asking them, what is it that you want from this Sector CSIRT, and what do you think you can provide that Sector CSIRT? So this is going out and engaging with stakeholders and sort of getting their take on things so that you can start to understand the challenges and how you can solve those challenges. Step 3 is organizing that information and evaluating gaps, understanding what's missing, right? What is not being done by this community, in this ecosystem right now? And how can we close those gaps? Then step 4, you build a roadmap, right? This is how we get from A to B, from where we are, our as-is state, over to our to-be state. So this is where you start to get into ruffling some of those feathers, right? We're going to change things. Maybe we need to pass a law. Maybe there needs to be new policies, new MOAs, things like that. So this is where we start to do that disruption thing, and we want to be really careful about taking into account the needs of the ecosystem and all the stakeholders. Planning and implementing, of course, very challenging. This is where we see a lot of efforts sort of go sideways or run into a little bit of trouble, because this is where things actually start to change, right? Now we actually have a facility. We're putting people there, and they're actually starting to execute their mission, and now we have new reporting requirements, we have new other requirements, et cetera, et cetera. So we really have to be careful here and understand how things are changing for everyone else, right? And then finally, post-implementation activities. This is about understanding what went wrong and what went right in your process, and then preparing for another round of development or another round of implementation. And of course, here it's very important to engage with the ecosystem and with all those stakeholders, so you can ask them, well, you know, how did this work for you? Was this successful? Is this benefiting you? Is this not benefiting you? And what can we do better maybe in the future? So again, 6 steps, and we're putting that national cybersecurity ecosystem at the center of things as we go throughout. So each of these core tasks has a corresponding set of considerations for the national cybersecurity ecosystem. I'm not going to go through these, kind of talked about them already, but they're in the document. And we just emphasize that you have to keep that in mind throughout the process. So this is an example of kind of going through the process. So this is looking at step 1, which is the prerequisites, right? So these are some of the prerequisites. It's not all the prerequisites, but just a couple of examples. So if we look at, let's look at this one here. So this is determining the services, which I already mentioned a little bit. So at the beginning of the process, right, when we're doing all these prerequisites in this preliminary work, what we want to do is evaluate and determine the services that are already being provided by other members of the national ecosystem, and then discuss what services it might be beneficial for the sector CSIRT to offer. Is it going to be services that are already provided elsewhere, and those are just going to move? Is it going to be duplicate services, or is it going to be new services? These are all the questions that we need to be asking as we go into information gathering. As you go into information gathering and then start to develop that roadmap, what you want to do is outline roles and responsibilities, outline new policies that clarify who's going to be doing what, right? Only then do you want to start implementing. And as you start implementing, this is when you do things like training and getting teams up to speed and getting them to actually offer these services and have that capability built in. Last thing, just talking about implementation. If you remember the earlier slide, we had those kind of original questions that we wanted to ask when we were understanding that national cybersecurity ecosystem. You know, what role will the national CSIRT play? What if there is no national CSIRT? So now that we're doing implementation, we want to rephrase those questions, and we want to ask how things have changed, right? Or how things are changing. So at the beginning we asked, what role will the national CSIRT play in that sector? Now we want to ask, now that we've implemented this, or now that we are implementing this, have those roles and responsibilities changed? Is the mission of the national CSIRT different now? What about the relationship between the sector CSIRT and the national CSIRT? We asked about that relationship when we were first considering this, but now that we're implementing, you have to think about, has this relationship changed? What's the new relationship between the national CSIRT and the sector? What's the new relationship between the national CSIRT and some of the actual constituents that are in the sector, right? They may have had a direct line to the national CSIRT before, maybe they don't anymore. Maybe they go to a national or to the sector CSIRT instead. How does this change anything, right? And then how does the sector CSIRT address issues related to working public and private? Again, when these implementation activities are done, you're having a lot of disruption, right? We talked about disruption and implementation and how they're related. We have to think about who's being disrupted, what's been changed, and how we can make sure that we're doing it in a positive way and leveraging all the capabilities rather than a negative way that sort of leaves some of the capabilities left to the side. So the last thing here I just wanted to share are a couple of use cases that we have for these Sector CSIRTs and for the framework itself. So these use cases just describe a couple of different models for implementing a Sector CSIRT. This is a model that has a national CSIRT as a lead. So we have reporting that's going to a national CSIRT, and then that national CSIRT will kind of triage and determine what sector it's going to communicate with, and it's going to say, okay, this report is related to the banking sector or the energy sector or the transportation sector, and then it's going to filter that down to the Sector CSIRT, and they'll say, yes, this is something that we can deal with, and they're going to start to work with their constituent organizations down here at the bottom. Or they're going to say, no, this isn't something that we feel we should do. We're going to kick it back up to the national CSIRT. So this is just a potential model where you might apply the Sector CSIRT framework. Another use case, this is more led at the lower levels. So this would be led by the Sector CSIRT and its constituents. So reporting might go directly either to the member of the sector or to the Sector CSIRT itself. And then they're going to triage it individually, and then they're going to communicate here in the middle and say, how do we want to handle this? Is this something that we need to escalate to the national CSIRT? Is it something that the Sector CSIRT will handle, or is it something that should just be handled by the individual organization? So a couple different models here, a couple different use cases, just for consideration of how each approach is different and how that ecosystem, how those members of that ecosystem work together based on whatever model you choose and however you take this, or whatever approach you take for this. So I just want to conclude by giving a shout out to the rest of my team here. I did not develop this on my own. We had a lot of hard work put in by the other members of the security ops team. So thank you to all these people. And there's our contact information if you want to contact our team if you have any questions about this or other issues. And then, of course, a link to the framework itself. So with that, take any questions.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. When you created this, did you look at what works and doesn't work in countries that already have this model up and running?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is yes. So if we go back to the... Yes, so if we go back to the steps, what we see is in step 6, which is post-implementation activities, the primary goal in this is actually to prepare for another round of development. So we see this more as cyclical rather than a straight line, which I've obviously illustrated it in a straight line. But we see it as cyclical. So if you have a capability that exists, that would basically be starting at the same point as these post-implementation activities. You'd be starting by wanting to do lessons learned from that original round of development. So we implemented a Sector CSIRT. We want to improve it or add new capabilities. So let's start with lessons learned and then go back to the beginning and start the process again. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, my name is Vilus. So thank you for the presentation. In my professional capacity through the last 2 years, I worked probably 4 teams from step 1 to step 5, at least in the middle for sectorial. And what triggered in your one of the slides, the definition that CERT, sectorial CERT, is a body of which is responsible for incident response. And I'm a little bit confused because incident response incident handling responsibility is with the asset owner, and sectorial CERT is not asset owner. So does it mean that it diminishes the responsibility of asset owner, or how do you explain this the first sentence? Because I see it instantly from my experience as well in the field, that if it says responsible, so then, but you don't own the assets, so this responsibility is confused. So I would suggest not either to rephrase or add extra explanation on this.
Yeah, so now I'm thinking of it from like a risk management perspective and saying who's responsible, ultimately responsible. So I think maybe you're right. We need to take the word responsible not quite so literally. It is a body that conducts incident response and management for a subset of economy. It's not ultimately responsible. You are correct there. So maybe that's a phrasing issue that we'll address with that definition. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Martin from Norway. I just want to follow up on Margot's question, and this is not a speech, it's just a little bit of background and context before I get to my question.
Sure.
But Norway has more than a decade's experience with Sector CSIRTs. And I think the most successful ones, like energy and finance, they came from within the sector. But then we also have some examples of supervisory authority for a sector trying to establish a sectoral CSIRT, and they had trust issues.
Yes.
So you mentioned interested parties. Does this framework provide any guidance on who those interested parties should be?
Yes. So we talk about what a stakeholder is. We define a stakeholder, and we don't really talk about like level of interest, what makes a party interested or not, but we talk about those stakeholders. And how you can identify stakeholders and make sure you're contacting all the stakeholders, involving them in the process. And it's interesting, you mentioned sometimes government agencies having trouble with that trust or something like that. One of the challenges we find is that if a regulatory body also tries to lead the sector CSIRT, you have trust issues. Right, it's a big problem, but sometimes there's mandates or things like that require it. But you're right, our experience has been the same. Sector CSIRTs that have been more sort of like organically grown from within tend to have less issues, and I think it's probably because that organic sort of growth naturally takes into account all the things that I've talked about or that we talk about in this document, because when it's organic, you're basically just using your community, your national cybersecurity ecosystem, and you're doing it together. When you come with this top-down approach, that's when I think you maybe need something like this guide to make sure you're taking all those stakeholders into account and taking their needs and desires into account as well. So yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. No more questions?
No more? All right. In that case, let's thank Justin for the presentation.
Thank you.